Welcome to The Writer's Dream. This is a show where authors can talk about how they write their books, how they publish their books, and how they market their books. You can find us on Facebook. The name of the page is, guess what? The Writer's Dream. You can also find us on YouTube. On YouTube, you have to search my full name, Linda Maria Frank, click on my picture, and I have probably upwards of 60 interviews with mostly Long Island authors. Long Island is a hotbed of authors. We have many, many of them. And if you're a reader or a writer, there's a lot of good information about the books that we talk about on the show. You can also find us at LTV. Go on the website, LTVEH, and I also have a spot on Cablevision. Currently, it's Friday afternoons at 3 o'clock on Channel 20. So you can find us all over the place. There's no excuse for not watching us. So today's author is another Long Island author by the name of Eve Karlin. And Eve is the author of City of Liars and Thieves, Love, Death, and Manhattan's First Great Mystery, which sounds fascinating. But today's featured book is Track 61. So hello, Eve, welcome. And can you give us a brief summary of the book before we get into the details?
Sure. Hi, Linda. So nice of you to have me today. Briefly, the book is about in 1942, as many people might know, 4 Nazi saboteurs came ashore in Amagansett, New York, they had a target in New York City. A lot of people know that happened. Very few seem to know what happened after they came ashore. So my novel is historical fiction, inspired by that landing, and it takes off from there.
Can you explain to people what actually happened after the landing, so that they have an idea of
Sure.
what you were inspired to come up with?
Incredible to believe that a Nazi U-boat landed just off Atlantic Beach in Amagansett and deposited these 4 men shortly after midnight on June 13th, 1942. They came ashore, and then they actually encountered a Coast Guardsman there on the beach in Amagansett, which is a reenactment that the Atlantic Coast Guard Station kind of reenacts every single summer. They encountered this young man, but he was alone, and he might have been suspicious, but being outnumbered, he went back to the Coast Guard Station, and these 4 men buried their cache of dynamite in the sand and slowly made their way to New York City.
Yes. But they pretty much were bumbling because they were picked up pretty quickly. They really
well. So here's the thing in my book that I really the book is based on the research that I did and the 3,000-page trial transcript that I read, and I think that it's a misconception that these men were bumbling. In fact, yeah, that's one of the largest misconceptions that I encountered. I mean, these men, 2 of the 4 turned themselves in. If they hadn't turned themselves in, I really don't know what might have happened.
Yeah, that's right. They did turn themselves. I mean, they were unsuccessful in carrying out a sabotage plot, which was, I guess, why people say that they're bumbling. But
they called the FBI. They landed on a Saturday night. By Sunday evening, they called the FBI.
Yeah, well, that's great that they turned themselves in, but they were put on the shore to carry out a sabotage, I think.
Sure.
I love what you did with this character. I really do. And I love the character, but we'll get into that. What inspired you to do this?
Well, I know this is a question that you explore in your show. So the roundabout kind of answer is that my first book, I was reading Ron Chernow's biography of Alexander Hamilton, and I came across this murder called the Manhattan murder. And when I looked into it, it was so fascinating to me. I discovered that I had lived across the street from a well in which a young woman had been murdered in 1800.
Wow.
And I lived there when I was 22, which is the same age that this woman, Elma Sands, was at the time of her murder. And the well still exists in the basement of a building on Spring Street. So I was so absorbed by that, of course, I pursued that story. And now when I set about writing my second book, Track 61, I really needed to find a story that had that same kind of hold on me. And I wanted to incorporate New York City history. So I started to look at the places I love in Manhattan, one of which was Grand Central Station. And when I looked at Grand Central and read about that being a potential sabotage target for these men, and then I put that together with the fact that I knew in the back of my mind, having grown up in Amagansett, that these 4 men had landed here in 42. So all of a sudden, the story, came to life for me because they landed on a beach I frequented my entire childhood. So the story is very meaningful to me.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have my own story about Grand Central Station. I used to do volunteer work in Central Park. I was a gardener, and I worked with one of the master gardeners, and she lived in the Bronx, and she would take the bus to the park every day. And one of the passengers who was on the bus with her every day was an FBI agent. And after 9/11, they would, he wasn't giving her any secret information, but they would talk pretty much about what was going on in the city as far as security is concerned. And he just said to her, stay out of Grand Central Station.
Really?
So Grand Central Station evidently is a target.
Well, yeah, millions of people travel through there every day.
Yes. I was surprised they didn't say Penn Station, but probably Grand Central Station is also iconic. Penn Station was at the time, but not anymore.
Sadly, yes.
So that's probably part of it. The plot is you created a character, a fictional character. Would you like to talk about her?
Yes. So the character is fictional, but isn't. She's a character based on my grandmother. When I thought about the fact that these Nazis landed on the beach, I also thought, of course, having grown up there, that I lived in a house with my parents and my sister and my grandparents who were refugees from Nazi Germany. And the irony that my grandmother watched my sister and I play on this beach where these saboteurs had landed struck me as significant. So I created this character based on my grandmother, who would have been a young woman at the time in 1942. And Greta, that's the character's name, and my grandmother's name, her plight is that of my grandmother's. No, did she meet a Nazi saboteur? She did not. But she was a young woman who had escaped Nazi Germany at that time.
Yeah, and explain how she meets the saboteurs.
So it's true that on the day that they landed, they arrived in New York City on June 13th, which is Flag Day. It was the largest military parade in U.S. history, with the parade marching up Fifth Avenue. So I created a scene. The men were, in fact, actually at that parade. And I dropped this character based on my grandmother into that parade, and she meets one of the men, Peter Berger, and becomes kind of embroiled in his mess.
And she's sort of, what I pick up from it is that she's lonely.
She's lonely.
Yeah. And she meets this intriguing individual. We won't say attractive, we'll just say intriguing. And then he brings her in contact with the other characters, which you could also describe. You do it better than I do.
Well, when I thought about my this character meeting one of the men, it seemed like Peter Berger was the most likely candidate to be kind of a love interest in her mind, not truly what one would think of as a love interest. And clearly he had more important issues on his mind, but she was a young woman and she was lonely. So he seemed like the best candidate because in all the court transcripts that I read, he was quite noble. All four of those saboteurs had been American citizens, or had lived in America. Actually, only one was a citizen, and so he was her age. He was eloquent. He was, he and George Dash, who were the leaders of the group, as I said, they turned themselves in pretty quickly. And in my head, what developed was a lot of questions as to why they were on this mission, why they did what they did. And it seemed like they had very little choice.
Well, I would assume that is true with everybody in the German, armed services. I mean, they were, the famous saying is, "I was only following orders," and I think it brings out the idea that the people in Germany were used, and many of them, I'm sure. I'm not trying to whitewash it, but I'm sure many of them really did not want war. They would much prefer peace. And I think you bring that out. I think you bring out the struggle that's going on in Peter, in particular, of what he really wants to do. And the other men, I think, they seem to be more committed to the whole situation.
Certainly, one was much more of a hardened, yeah.
He was the one who kicked the lady in the subway, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
On
the parade, but she's going down into the subway.
I
yes. thought that was important because it pointed out what you were trying to show, I think, was the duality in the minds of at least Peter, where he would prefer to have peace and not be engaged in this, whereas the other gentleman was all into the whole Nazi thing.
I mean, my circumstances, one's circumstances really determine, I felt like, whether you wind up being a traitor or you wind up being a hero. I mean, when you look at what's happening in Russia and Ukraine right now, it's just a question of what side of the line you're born on.
Same in the Middle East. Yeah. They're all complicated. They aren't very simple.
It's not black and white at all.
No. So setting was, of course, New York City, which is just a wealth of things that you can. So talk about how you research the setting, the various places.
I think that I mean, that's really the fun of writing historical fiction. Well, certainly I did lots of tours of Grand Central. I went to Grant's tomb at a very quiet time because, in fact, the saboteurs did have a meeting there at Grant's tomb, the Chrysler Building. I just tried to incorporate the places that were, meant a lot to me. It's just very interesting. And the beach in Amagansett, I mean, you can sit there today and imagine in the fog, so little has changed that, 70 years ago or so, this event took place. As far as research, I mean, I think I watch a ton of movies that are set in that era. I read a lot of books. There have been a couple really good nonfiction books on the subject. And so I do that. I try to talk to people.
Yeah, well, if you go into New York, people complain that New Yorkers are not friendly. And I always have to explain to them that if you live in New York, you are surrounded by 8 million other people, and you don't say good morning to everyone. Because you would never get done with that. Plus the fact that you need to, when you live in such a dense place as New York, you need to have your space bubble to present.
Yeah, but New York has neighborhoods. I find, within one's neighborhood, people. You have some habits, same as other people.
I'm sorry, but my famous story is that I always tell people who are who say that to me, that New Yorkers are not friendly. I said, go to New York and stand in a subway station with a map in front of your face.
Mhm.
5 people will come up to you, ask you where you're going, tell you all about it, and they'll each give you directions, and every one of them will give you a different way to get there.
Yeah,
And they'll all be right.
right.
So I am a person who also loves New York, so I find myself defending it often. But
There's just so much history under one's feet. I mean, I just started to realize that no matter where you scrape what surface,
well,
there's
not only New
stories.
York, not only
Yeah.
the city, but Long Island. Long Island.
Lots of places.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's. I mean, I have had many authors on the show who use some aspect of Long Island history to write a book, and they're all fascinating.
Mhm.
I do a lecture on women spies, and I start out with the Culper spy ring from Setauket, which was the most successful spy ring for George Washington in the Revolutionary War.
Mhm.
So, yeah, it's an interesting place. I'd like to read a couple of reviews, if you don't mind.
Oh, sure.
One is by Amy Turner, and I actually had Amy Turner on the show.
Mhm.
The author has so seamlessly interwoven fiction and nonfiction that it is difficult to accept that the personal relationship between the young German refugee and the saboteur didn't actually happen. That's good to hear. That's a testament to the writing, crisp yet detailed, and to the pacing, suspenseful and propulsive. The author conveys the confusion and deeply conflicted feelings of the protagonist with great insight and understanding. And on top of all of that, I learned much about New York City during World War II. I highly recommend this book. And then there's another one by a person I don't know who it was. Oh, it was unknown Amazon purchaser. Karlin places her reader in a particular historical moment through her crisp and meticulously rendered descriptions. The characters allow the reader to consider the complex challenges faced by those displaced by war and the longing to belong. So the way you portrayed the character really got across. And I like Greta. I am really liking her. So is there anything else you would like to say about the book? Because I'd like to talk a little bit about marketing and publishing.
I just want to say about historical fiction in general, truth is always stranger than fiction. That's one thing that I've stumbled across. And I think that if you can incorporate, if you have the freedom of calling it historical fiction, there's some really amazing stories out there that come to life when you add dialogue.
I absolutely agree with that. And I've been asked about writer's block, what to do about writer's block. And I've said, no matter what your story is, it's set someplace.
Mhm.
And if you research the setting, you're going to find things that are very interesting. I don't care where it is. There's going to be something interesting that is going to spark an idea for you and make your story it'll cure your writer's block because then you'll want to write about it, but also it will make your story more interesting.
For sure. It's a bit of a rabbit hole once you go down that and start looking at
that's true.
newspapers.
Especially with the internet. There's no end
Yeah.
of the trail that you take. It reminds me of wormholes.
Yeah.
So how did you publish?
So the first book was published. It was published by Ballantine, and it wound up it was acquired by Ballantine, and then it wound up being an ebook product of Ballantine. It sold very, very well, but it was disappointing. I had wanted it not to be simply an ebook. It sold very well, but that was the catch with that one. But I had a great experience with my editor and their publicity team, so that was nice. So the second book, I went another route. I went to a small press on the West Coast, and they published the book.
It seems like small press is the choice of many, many authors. I went with the whole Anti-Tillery series was with bigger self-publishing companies. And I wasn't disappointed because I didn't know what I was doing. I started writing when I was 60. And I mean, what did I know about writing a book? And I learned a lot, and they were in the beginning very good. They started to, their services, in my opinion, started to deteriorate because I think they were overwhelmed, and they started hiring a lot of people to do the editing and whatnot who were very new at it. And so the last two books I've written, I just did them on KDP, but you don't get any services there because the big thing is the distributor. It isn't so much the publisher, it's the distributor.
It's for sure, it's very important. I mean, I know on the flip side, working in a retail bookstore, that it's, it's vital. Bookstores have to be able to get the book.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well,
And where that book is placed and positioned in the store is a very
without a
big
doubt.
deal.
I did a lecture on how to self-publish, and I would usually do it in a bookstore or a library, and I would say to the audience, look at all these books here. How many of each one of these books sells every day? And I said, most of them don't sell anything. What sells is that cardboard thing in front of the cash register with James Patterson or Stephen King, or, that's the money that publishers put into book marketing is basically with their bestsellers, because that's where they get the profit back.
100%, except for I'd like to also put in a word for independent bookstores and word of mouth, and booksellers who truly love books like my colleagues and myself,
But that's
sometimes that works.
If that's your bookstore, which is a much better situation for especially a new author. And a word of advice that I give is go local, go to your local papers. If you have a local store, start local, and you'll be much happier. And we have a few more minutes, and since you are a manager of a bookstore or the owner?
No, just a bookseller, and I do the book club. I run the book club.
Nice. Yeah. So what advice would you give to readers and writers?
Well, I mean, readers and writers. I mean, for writers, certainly read.
Mm-hmm.
And it's true. I think you're right. When I started working in the bookstore, you realize how many books there are, and all because there's, a store has one or two, or a great big pile of Britney Spears versus one or two of this author's first novel. That novel traveled through many, many hands to be where it is in that bookstore, and it really is worthy. There's so many great books out there.
Oh, there are.
All because it's not in a pile doesn't mean it's not a terrific book.
Do you think that book discussion groups inspire writers? It's a strange question, I know.
You mean workshops or book clubs?
No, like just a book club where there's like you're in a bookstore and you lead a book discussion on a particular book. Do you think you ever get anybody in the group who's an aspiring writer, and that what you discuss and how you discuss it influences?
I hope so. We have some pretty terrific members of our book club. Some have been professors, some are writers. So I think with every book, there's so much more. Sure, there's the plot. And but there are a lot of other things like the structure, the voice, the way chronology fans out. So there are all these things to discuss when you start to pull apart a book, and perhaps someone has an aha moment. I mean, that's terrific. They see, oh, I see how that writer accomplished that, and I think I could maybe do that. That's terrific.
Yeah, see, I find that helpful with my writing, is to listen to what readers say about the book. And
sure,
because when you write a book and you want to sell it, you need to appeal to those to the reader. So we have about a minute and a half left. What's next on your agenda?
I'm working on a new historical book. And I realize as I'm doing that, it's really the best part. A first draft is terrible. And so I'm resigned to what people call, the shitty first draft. You just say, just let me get something down, a beginning, a middle, and end, and then I can go back and look at it and look at it and look at it as you will, to make it into a product that I'm really proud of. But it is also really the fun part, and one should kind of savor the process.
Can you give us an idea of a little bit about what it's about?
Well, I like you. I love New York City. I love New York City history. And so it's not a murder, because I kind of was like, oh, so many books are about murders. But it's a pretty intriguing crime.
All right.
So,
That sounds very exciting. So I look forward to it, and I am going to finish your book and find out what happens to Greta. So
yeah. And the men too.
Well, yeah,
Pretty sad fate.
the men. So thank you for coming on the show. It's been
Thank you.
interesting. And another great Long Island writer.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, you're welcome. Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.